Story number 1. The Forgotten Ride. The night was thick with fog when the carriage first appeared. It wasn't there 1 minute, and the next, there it was, parked in the middle of the street like it had been waiting for someone. The town of Willowbrook, known for its quiet roads and sleepy charm, had never seen anything like it. A carriage, black and grand, but old, too old, seemed to have materialized out of the mist. Its wheels, once polished, now sagged under the weight of time. The wooden frame was rotting in places, the paint chipped, and the horses, if they could still be called that, stood frozen, their eyes glazed over with a strange, unnatural stillness. They weren't the kind of horses you'd see pulling carriages today. No. These were ghostly figures, their coats matted and their flesh almost transparent. Isaac Trent, a man in his late 30s with graying hair and tired eyes, stood across the street, watching. He had just come out of his shop, a small, dusty antique store he ran, filled with forgotten treasures and old things no one seemed to care about anymore. But when he saw the carriage, something in his chest tightened. He recognized it. It couldn't be, but it was. He walked closer, almost as if drawn to it, the fog curling around his ankles. The carriage had a familiarity to it, a haunting sense of nostalgia that made him stop in his tracks. He could almost hear the sound of its wheels rolling on the cobblestone streets from decades ago, from when he was a boy. The carriage had been his family's. It had been there, parked at the edge of their estate every Sunday morning, waiting to carry them to church or family gatherings. His father used to sit in the front, looking ahead with that distant, almost empty expression on his face. The same expression he had on his face now as Isaac stood there, staring at the forgotten ride. The driver was the first to catch his eye. A figure hunched over the reins, wearing a weathered black coat and a top hat that was too large for his head. The driver's face was a shadow under the brim, but Isaac knew that he knew him. The man was someone from his past. Someone, no, not someone. Something he had tried to forget. It was as though time had stopped, the air thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Isaac took another step forward, his legs shaking beneath him. The horses didn't move, their vacant eyes never leaving him. And then the door to the carriage opened, creaking like it hadn't been touched in years. Out stepped a woman. Her hair, long and gray, hung in tangled strands over her face. Her clothes, old-fashioned but elegant, flowed behind her like a ghostly train. She did not speak. She simply watched Isaac with hollow eyes. There was a coldness to her gaze, something icy, something that sent a shiver down Isaac's spine. But as he took a step toward her, he realized the truth in his gut. They were not of this world. The woman's lips moved slightly as if whispering to the air, but the words never reached him. Then, as Isaac's heart began to race, the passengers started to disembark. They stepped out one by one, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were part of a ritual that had been taking place for years. There were 4 in total. The man who had driven the carriage, the woman, and 2 others, both dressed in fine, old-fashioned clothes that were yellowing at the edges. Isaac stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. These were the people from the carriage of his youth, but they were different now. Changed. Something had happened to them, something he couldn't quite grasp. They weren't living. He could see it in their eyes. And then it hit him. The carriage, this cursed, rotting thing, wasn't from the past at all. It was stuck, frozen in time, caught between worlds. The driver, the passengers, they were all trapped in that moment, forced to repeat a journey they couldn't escape. And Isaac somehow was caught in it too. He was meant to join them, to become part of that endless cycle, whether he wanted to or not. You shouldn't be here," Isaac whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the passengers or to himself. The woman with the gray hair smiled, if it could be called that. It was not a friendly smile, but one that twisted her face into something monstrous. Her eyes, those dark, unblinking eyes, locked onto Isaac as if to remind him of something. Something terrible. The fog grew thicker around him, and suddenly, the carriage seemed to loom over him, suffocating him with its presence. The horses were no longer standing still, their hooves now clicking against the cobblestone. Isaac tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick tar. His vision blurred, and in that moment, he understood. He was part of it now. The forgotten ride had come for him. It had always come for him. The last thing Isaac heard before the fog consumed him was the soft creak of the carriage door closing behind him. Story number 2. Whispers on the Wind. Ethan and Sarah had been driving for hours when the storm rolled in. It started as a few heavy drops on the windshield, but soon the rain came down in sheets, slapping against the car with a deafening roar. The wind picked up too, howling like some animal trapped in the woods, shaking the trees along the side of the road. "Maybe we should stop for the night," Sarah suggested, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "We can't drive like this." Ethan glanced over at her. She was right. The narrow country road stretched out ahead, swallowed by darkness. They'd been passing through small towns for miles, each one quieter than the last. "All right, let's find somewhere to stay," he said, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. They soon came across a small, dimly lit sign that read, "The Old Oak Inn." It looked like the kind of place you'd see in an old postcard. A rickety building, weathered by time, with a porch that sagged under the weight of the years. Still, it would do. It had to. The innkeeper was a woman in her late 50s, with a tired face and eyes that seemed to have seen more than they should have. She gave them a key to a room upstairs, but looked at them strangely, as if there was something they needed to know, something unspoken. "Stay inside tonight. The storm's bad, and there's a place you'll want to stay away from," she warned, her voice low, almost a whisper. "What place?" Sarah asked, glancing at Ethan. "The carriage house," the woman replied quickly. "It's not a good place. Don't go near it." With that, the innkeeper left them standing in the hallway, her footsteps fading into the background noise of the storm outside. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though the building itself was holding its breath. After dinner, they retired to their room, but the storm continued to howl outside, rattling the windows and causing the walls to creak. It was hard to sleep with the constant noise, and the wind seemed to be calling to them, urging them to do something. Curiosity got the better of them. "We should check out that carriage house," Ethan said, his voice hesitant but intrigued. Sarah frowned, looking at the small window of their room where the rain battered against the glass. "I don't know." The innkeeper seemed serious. "I'm just curious," he replied. "How bad can it be?" Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed. They pulled on jackets and made their way downstairs. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind was still fierce, tugging at their clothes as they made their way toward the back of the inn, where the carriage house stood. It was hidden in shadows, the large wooden doors barely visible in the dim light. The moment they stepped inside, a chill ran down Sarah's spine. The air was damp, musty, and heavy with a strange, oppressive feeling. The carriage house smelled of old leather and decay. They could just make out the shape of the carriage in the corner, an old black thing with cracked wheels, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The silence was unnerving, as if the place had been abandoned for years. "Should we look inside?" Ethan asked, his voice low, uncertain. Before Sarah could answer, a gust of wind howled through the cracks in the building, sending a shiver through them both. Ethan hesitated but then pushed open the door to the carriage. Inside, there was nothing but an old, tattered seat and more dust. But it was the smell that hit them next, that made Sarah's stomach turn. It was a sickly, sweet scent that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. She stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't explain, and then she saw it. Faint, almost invisible, carved into the wood of the carriage's frame. A name, Alice. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept through the carriage house, slamming the door shut behind them. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's eyes were wide, and he turned toward the back of the room. There was a faint whisper, like the wind itself was speaking. Alice. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. Ethan grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "We need to go, Sarah, now." They turned to leave, but as they reached for the door, a sudden vision struck them, like a flash of lightning. They saw a young woman, her face pale and twisted in pain, her body trapped inside the carriage, her eyes pleading for help. And then the whisper came again, louder now, almost frantic. "Join me!" The door slammed open, and they ran, not looking back, their hearts pounding in their chests. They stumbled through the yard, the wind howling in their ears, the whispers growing louder, urging them toward the carriage. Back inside the inn, they slammed the door behind them, gasping for breath. The innkeeper was waiting in the hallway, her face solemn. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Who? What is this?" Ethan demanded. "Alice," the woman said, her eyes sad. "She died in that carriage years ago. She was the innkeeper's daughter. She died in the storm, trapped inside it, and her spirit's been trapped there ever since. The carriage house is cursed." Sarah felt her stomach twist. "Why didn't you warn us?" The innkeeper sighed. "I did, but curiosity, it has a way of getting the better of people." They stood there in the cold hallway as the storm raged outside. The whispers on the wind grew fainter, but they still lingered, carried on the breeze. Ethan and Sarah knew they had a choice to make. Leave, or join Alice, forever. Story number 3. The Phantom Coach. The fog came in thick that night, like a blanket smothering everything in its path. It was the kind of night you couldn't see past your own hand, the kind that made the world feel small and suffocating. Laura Miller, the town's schoolteacher, sat in her small, dimly lit kitchen, staring out the window at the swirling mist. She'd heard the wind howling all day, but it was just another storm to her, another cold night to endure in the little village of Briarwood. It was late when she decided to head to bed. The children at school had been restless all day, distracted by the storm brewing outside, and Laura had spent the afternoon trying to keep them focused. She lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, far from the busy roads. Her days were mostly quiet, filled with the usual routines of teaching, grading papers, and the occasional conversation with a few of the locals. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It started with a story one of her students had told her earlier that day. A story she had heard in passing before, but had never given much thought to. "It's the Phantom Coach, Miss Miller," young Timmy Dalton had said, his wide eyes gleaming with excitement. "The coach only comes out on the foggiest nights, drawn by horses that don't look alive." Laura had smiled politely, trying not to dismiss the story outright. Briarwood had its fair share of ghost stories, and she'd heard them all. A village this old had its secrets, but none that ever seemed to stand up to the daylight. "Oh? And where does it go, Timmy?" she had asked, indulging him for a moment. "To the graveyard," Timmy had answered, lowering his voice. "It's the ghost of a woman who was murdered years ago. Her body's in the graveyard, and she still rides the coach, looking for someone to help her." Laura had laughed, shaking her head. "That's an interesting story, Timmy, but I think you've been reading too many ghost books." But as she lay in bed that night, the fog pressing against the window and the howling wind outside, Timmy's words kept echoing in her mind. The phantom coach. Around midnight, she was lying awake, staring at the ceiling when she thought she heard something. At first, it was just a faint sound, something distant, like the rumble of wheels on gravel. But then it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of a carriage drawn by horses. It wasn't the wind nor the storm, this was something real. Curiosity gnawed at her. She pulled on her robe and rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog was so thick she could barely make out the edge of her yard. But there it was, a shadow moving slowly through the mist, the outline of an old carriage, drawn by horses that barely seemed to be alive. Their eyes were hollow, their coats matted and dirty, and the carriage itself was ancient, its wood rotting, wheels half broken. The horses moved like they were dragging the carriage, not pulling it. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard the story, but she hadn't believed it. Until now. The phantom coach. She stepped back from the window, her hands trembling. Her pulse raced in her ears. Should she go outside? Should she follow it? The thought was absurd. She didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something pulling at her, something compelling her to go. Before she could think further, the fog swallowed the carriage, and it was gone. The next day, Laura couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. She tried to focus on her lessons, but the image of the phantom coach haunted her thoughts. The horse's eyes, the creak of the carriage, it was all too vivid to be a dream. That evening, she heard it again, the rumble of wheels, the dragging hooves. This time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and rushed outside, following the sound through the thickening fog. The air was damp and cold, her breath coming in clouds as she stepped out into the night. The fog seemed to move with her, swirling around her legs as she made her way toward the village cemetery, which lay at the edge of town. As she walked deeper into the mist, she felt the ground beneath her feet turn soft and uneven. And then, just ahead, she saw it. The carriage, waiting at the gates of the graveyard. The horses stood still, their heads hanging low, their eyes locked on her as if they were waiting for something. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, and her legs shook with fear. She tried to turn around, but the fog closed in tighter, and the night seemed to press against her. Suddenly, the carriage door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. The woman was dressed in a tattered gown, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide and unblinking. Laura froze, unable to move. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel the weight of the sorrow and anger behind them. The woman stepped closer, and Laura could hear her faint voice, like a whisper on the wind. "Help me, please, I need justice." The air grew colder, the fog thicker, and the wind seemed to howl in pain. Laura felt a chill that ran deep into her bones. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The woman's eyes burned into her, demanding something terrible. "Who are you?" Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman's lips moved again, but the words were unclear, lost in the wind. Laura took a step back, her fear rising like a tide, and then the woman's face twisted in a flash of pain. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing against Laura's arm, and in that moment Laura saw it all, a murder. A young woman killed in cold blood, her body left to rot in the graveyard. a life cut short, and a spirit left to wander the earth, seeking justice that would never come. Until now. The woman was not just asking for help, she was demanding it. Laura stumbled backward, gasping for air. The phantom coach seemed to shift, the horse's eyes now burning with an unnatural hunger. The woman's whisper became a scream, "Help me!" Suddenly, Laura understood. The ghost wasn't looking for justice. It was offering something else, something far more terrifying. Justice had a price, and it wasn't just the life of the murderer, it was hers. In a desperate rush, Laura turned and ran, but the fog closed in around her, the sound of the carriage following her every step, the whispers growing louder, calling her name. She stumbled over the uneven ground, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. By the time the sun rose, Laura was back at her cottage, but the phantom was still with her. Its whispers lingered in her ears, and the cold touch of the woman's hand still burned on her skin. Laura Miller would never leave Briarwood. The phantom coach had come for her, and now it would never let her go. Story number 4. The Cursed Journey. It was the kind of night where the road seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt leading to nowhere. The air was thick with dampness, and a cold wind whipped through the trees, causing them to sway like dark, skeletal figures in the moonlight. There were no stars in the sky, just a blanket of heavy clouds that seemed to smother the world. Carl Benton had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He'd been on the road all day, traveling from one small town to the next, hoping to make it to the city by morning. But with the storm brewing and the darkness creeping in, he knew it would be a while before he could find a decent place to rest. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind numb from exhaustion. When he saw the sign for the rest stop, he almost didn't stop. It was a small, lonely place on the side of the road, with no lights except for the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The parking lot was empty, save for an old black carriage that was parked by the gas station. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in this time, this world. Carl pulled into the lot and parked his car. He hadn't meant to stop, but his body was screaming for a break. The road had been too empty, the quiet too unnerving. Maybe a quick rest, a stretch of the legs, and he could get back on his way. As he stepped out of the car, a chill ran down his spine. The fog had rolled in thicker now, wrapping the rest stop in an eerie silence. The air felt heavy, like something was watching him. He shook it off and started walking toward the small rundown diner near the restrooms. That's when he saw the driver. The man sat on the carriage's bench, hunched over the reins, his face hidden in shadow beneath the brim of his wide, black hat. He wasn't wearing a uniform or anything that made him look like someone who belonged to this time. He looked out of place, like something from another era, maybe even another world. The driver's eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, met Carl's, and the man gave a slow, almost deliberate nod. Carl paused, feeling the weight of that gaze on him. He didn't know why, but something about the man, no, the carriage, seemed wrong. "You look tired, traveler," the driver called out, his voice low and gravelly, like it had been pulled through 1,000 years of dust. "Need a ride?" Carl hesitated. There were plenty of other places he could go. The city wasn't far, but something about the way the driver spoke, so inviting, so calm, made it hard to turn away. I'm fine," Carl said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was tired, bone-deep tired, and the thought of the journey ahead, of the endless miles, seemed impossible in that moment. Maybe just a few miles, just to rest his eyes. The driver's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Come on then, don't let the night fool you, it's safer with company." The invitation felt like a lure, and yet Carl found himself walking toward the carriage, his legs moving of their own accord. There was no clear reason why he accepted, no sudden rush of excitement or relief, just a strange pull that seemed to come from the carriage itself. The door creaked open, and Carl stepped up, sliding into the dark, velvet interior. The air inside was thick with an unfamiliar scent, like old leather and dust, with something else beneath it. A musty, rotting smell that clawed at his throat. He glanced around, but there was no sign of a driver's cabin or any other seating, just the bench where the driver sat. Before Carl could question it, the door slammed shut behind him, and the carriage lurched forward, beginning its journey down the empty road. The windows were clouded with fog, obscuring the view, but Carl didn't mind. He closed his eyes, hoping the rhythmic creak of the wheels would lull him to sleep. But something was wrong. Something felt off. He opened his eyes again and looked out the window, but all he could see was darkness. The road stretched on endlessly, as though it had no end. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. Carl shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. He checked his watch. It was broken. He checked the road outside, but there was nothing but blackness. The driver didn't speak, his hands steady on the reins. The horses, if they could even be called horses, seemed to move without effort, their hooves making a hollow sound on the road. The carriage rocked gently, and yet the road ahead was endless. No turns, no signs, no exits, just a flat, unyielding stretch of nothingness. "Where are we going?" Carl finally asked, his voice hoarse. The driver didn't respond. Instead, he just continued to stare ahead, his hat casting a shadow over his face. Carl felt a cold chill creep up his spine. Something was wrong. Something that went beyond just being lost. This wasn't just a detour. The air felt thick, suffocating, and Carl could feel his chest tightening with each passing minute. "Stop the carriage," Carl said, more urgently this time. "I need to get off. Let me out." The driver's hands didn't move. The horses continued at their steady pace. The fog outside had thickened to the point where Carl could barely see his own hands in front of his face. His breath became shallow, quick. The unease grew into something worse, something that gnawed at him from the inside. "You're not going anywhere," the driver finally said, his voice like an echo from the past, something ancient and dead. Carl's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. The carriage wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The wheels groaned, the horse's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and Carl could feel the weight of something dark pressing down on him. His pulse quickened. He tried the door again, but it was locked, sealed shut, as if the carriage itself was keeping him inside. The road stretched on, the miles piled up, and still there was no end. Carl's thoughts began to scatter, his mind splintering with panic. The more he thought about escape, the stronger the feeling of being pulled back in, by the wheels, by the horses, by the air itself. The driver turned slightly and Carl caught a glimpse of his eyes, cold and endless like a black pit. The man smiled, and Carl could see the sharp, hollow teeth that glinted in the dark. "Don't worry," the driver whispered, the words a soft rasp in the air. "The journey never ends, and neither do you." Carl screamed as the darkness swallowed him whole. The carriage continued, its wheels never slowing, its horses never tiring, feeding off his fear, dragging him forever down a road that had no end. Story number 5. The Widow's Ride. James had never felt loneliness like this. The house was too quiet. The silence of his wife, Clara, not filling the rooms was deafening. He'd lost her only a week ago. One moment, she was there, laughing with him over coffee in the kitchen. The next, she was gone. taken by a heart attack that struck so suddenly it felt like a cruel joke. Now, every corner of the house reminded him of her absence. The creaky floorboards where she used to walk, the smell of her lavender perfume lingering in the air. Even the half-finished book she'd been reading, still open on the coffee table. James didn't know what to do with himself. He wandered the house in a daze, looking for something to fill the hole in his chest, but there was nothing. There was only the heavy, empty space where Clara's warmth had once been. That was until it started. It was dusk the first time he saw it. The carriage, sitting just beyond the tree line at the edge of their property, barely visible in the dimming light. It was an old-fashioned black coach, drawn by two horses with hollow eyes. James wasn't sure why he even noticed it. He had just stepped outside, his mind still foggy from a restless night, when he saw the shape moving at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was his grief playing tricks on him, a figment of his imagination, or maybe just the haze of the setting sun. But then it happened again, night after night. The carriage always appearing at dusk, waiting, as though it had been waiting for him. And then, one night, he saw her. James was walking toward the edge of the yard, drawn by some force he couldn't explain, when he saw the figure through the window of the carriage. She was sitting there, her face pale and still, her eyes unblinking, staring straight at him. It took a moment for the shock to hit him, for him to recognize the face of the woman sitting in that carriage. It was Clara. Her image was unchanged, her beauty untouched by death. She was sitting in the carriage as if she were alive, except for the fact that she was completely motionless, her eyes locked onto his. The moment froze in time. The cold wind blew past him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He wanted to call her name, to run to her, but his legs felt like stone. Then she did something that made his heart stop. She lifted her hand and gestured toward him. A slow, deliberate motion, as if she were beckoning him to join her in the carriage. The light from the setting sun caught her pale face, casting an eerie glow around her, making her look even more ethereal. James stood there for a long time, watching her. His chest tightened, and his mind raced. Was this real? Was he imagining things? Was his grief so deep that it had brought him to this point, where his dead wife was calling him from some strange carriage in the dusk? He shook his head and stumbled back toward the house, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But every night the carriage appeared, and every night Clara sat inside, beckoning him to join her. At first, he refused. The thought of joining her, of leaving everything behind, terrified him. He knew he could never truly be with her again. She was gone, and the world of the living had no place for the dead. But the more he resisted, the more the urge to go grew. The air grew colder when the carriage appeared. The whispers, faint but unmistakable, seemed to follow him around the house. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the feeling of her presence was everywhere. One evening, his curiosity won. He couldn't stand it anymore. He needed to know what was happening. He went to the local library hoping to find some explanation, something to make sense of the strange occurrences. There, an old book caught his eye, buried under stacks of other forgotten volumes. It was about the history of the town, about things long buried and hidden from view. He flipped through it, the pages yellowing and brittle, until something stopped him cold. There, in a faded photograph, was the same carriage, and there, sitting inside, was the same woman. The caption beneath the photo read, "The Widow, 1915, her final ride." James read the passage with growing dread. The woman in the photograph had been the wife of a wealthy man who had died suddenly. She was left alone, devastated by his death. It was said that she would ride in the carriage every evening, waiting for him to come back to her. But one night, The carriage had crashed. Her body was never found. It was said that her spirit remained bound to the carriage, cursed to ride it every dusk, forever waiting for the return of her husband. The more James read, the more the fear settled into his bones. The woman's name was Eleanor, and it was said that she had never been able to leave the carriage, cursed to roam the earth for eternity. And now, somehow, her spirit was reaching out to him. But why? Why Clara? That night, he stood at the edge of his property again, his heart racing. He watched the carriage approach as the sun set, casting the world in shadows. He could see Clara's face in the window, her pale eyes locked on his. The wind picked up, and the air grew thick with a coldness that gripped him. Clara's hand lifted once more, beckoning him to join her. His mind screamed for him to turn away, but his legs betrayed him. Before he knew it, he was walking toward the carriage, his steps slow, as if in a trance. He was almost there when something pulled him back, a voice in his head, a warning. "Don't go, James." He froze. The voice was Clara's, but it wasn't coming from the carriage. It was coming from inside his mind. The truth hit him like a punch to the stomach. Clara wasn't just reaching out to him, she was warning him. The carriage wasn't just a ride, it was a trap. And if he joined her, he would be bound to the same curse, doomed to live out his days with her, riding that endless road to nowhere. James turned away from the carriage and ran back to the house, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he'd ever escape the pull of that haunted ride, but one thing was certain: he couldn't join her. Not now, not ever. But even as he ran, he could feel the carriage following him, and with each passing night the whispers of the widow grew louder. He knew that his refusal had come at a price. The price of his soul. Story number 6. The Old Road. The small town of Black Hollow had always been quiet. Too quiet for most people's liking. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest city, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, but not much else. It was the kind of place where stories whispered on the wind, and you learned to keep to yourself. The Harpers were new to Black Hollow. They had moved into the old house at the end of the road, an imposing, weather-worn place that had once belonged to the town's carriage makers. The family of 4, Ben, Claire, and their 2 children, Lily and Sam, were looking for a fresh start, a break from the hustle of city life. They didn't know much about the house's history, but they'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in Black Hollow had. The place had been abandoned for years, its windows dark and its doors locked tight. No one had dared to live there for as long as anyone could remember. But the Harpers were different. They weren't scared of old houses or small towns, and they figured they could handle whatever Black Hollow threw their way. That was before the noises started. At first, it was just a creak, a sound so faint that Claire thought it might be the wind or the old timbers of the house settling. But then it came again, louder this time. A long, drawn-out squeal, like the wheels of a carriage on an old dirt road. Ben thought it was just the trees groaning in the wind. But when it happened again the next night, and the night after that, he started to wonder. Claire noticed it too, the way the sound seemed to come from down the old road, a stretch of dirt that ran through the woods and led to nowhere. It was as if someone, or something, was traveling down that road in the dead of night. It wasn't long before Lily started to hear it too. Lily was 10, with bright, curious eyes, and an imagination that was as wild as the forest that surrounded their home. She loved to explore, and when she wasn't playing with Sam, she would wander through the woods, picking flowers or collecting strange rocks she found by the stream. But after a week of hearing the strange sound, she couldn't resist anymore. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lily slipped out of the house, her curiosity burning inside her. She followed the old road, the creaking noise growing louder with every step. It was as though the road itself was alive, calling to her. The woods around her seemed to grow darker, thicker, the trees closing in like silent witnesses to her journey. The sound grew louder and louder until Lily thought she could feel the ground beneath her tremble. Then, through the trees, she saw it. The carriage. It was old, covered in layers of dirt and moss, its wheels half buried in the forest floor. The wood was dark and rotting, the once grand details faded and warped by time. But it was the horses that caught her attention. They were skeletal, their bones jutting out of their skin like something from a nightmare. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, empty and soulless. The carriage was still, but Lily could feel its presence, the weight of something ancient and wrong hanging in the air. Before she could get any closer, she felt a cold gust of wind rush past her, and she heard it. Voices, soft at first, whispering in a language she didn't understand. The sound came from inside the carriage, and it felt as though it were pulling her toward it. Lily took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The air around her grew heavier, colder, as if something was holding her in place. She could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if they were calling her name. And then she saw them. The riders. They were ghosts. Pale and translucent, their faces twisted in pain. Their eyes were wide with terror, their hands gripping the reins of the horses. They were trapped, bound to the carriage by some curse that kept them riding the road forever and ever. Lily's breath caught in her throat as one of them turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, empty pits, and his mouth moved as if he were speaking, but no sound came out. She could feel the terror radiating from him, could feel the weight of his sorrow and his desperation. And then she understood. The carriage wasn't just some abandoned relic. It was part of something much darker, something that had been unfinished for years, a legacy that hadn't been allowed to die. The riders were trapped, doomed to relive their final journey over and over again, unable to escape. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the riders were trying to communicate with her, to tell her something, but the words were lost in the wind. Lily's heart raced. She knew, deep down, that she had uncovered something terrible. The carriage wasn't just a haunted relic, it was cursed, bound to the road, to the riders, and to the town itself. When she finally broke free from the trance and ran back to the house, her mind was reeling. She couldn't tell her parents. How could she? They would think she was crazy. But she knew what she had seen. She knew the carriage was alive, that it was waiting for someone to finish what it had started. The next night, the creaking came again. This time, louder, more persistent. Lily heard it through her window, the eerie squeal of the wheels turning, the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. She could feel it in her bones, the pull of the old road, the call of the carriage. But this time, Lily didn't go. This time, she stayed inside, her hands shaking with the weight of what she had learned. She could feel the eyes of the riders on her, could hear their whispers in the night, calling for help, calling for someone to finish their cursed journey. The road outside their house was quiet again, but Lily knew it wouldn't last. The carriage would return, just as it had every night before, and the riders would continue their endless journey, waiting for someone to join them, to finish what they had started all those years ago, and one day someone would. Story number 7. The Coachman's Curse. It was the kind of night that made Ethan restless, the kind of night that made him wonder if the stories the old folks told had more truth in them than he'd ever cared to believe. The air was thick with fog, and the streets of town were deserted, the kind of silence that made everything feel too still, too quiet. Ethan had never been one to shy away from a dare, though. The talk around the school had been the same for years. Tales about the old carriage that appeared on the outskirts of town every so often. The kind of carriage that didn't belong in this time. A black, mysterious thing, with wheels that never seemed to touch the ground, and windows that always remained dark, no matter how many times someone looked inside. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was a way for the dead to travel. Ethan didn't care much for legends. He was 16, and legends were for kids who still believed in monsters under the bed. That night, on a dare, Ethan found himself standing by the old dirt road leading out of town. The fog hung low, making everything look distorted, like he was in a different world. That's when he saw it, the carriage, slowly coming down the road, moving at a steady pace despite the fact that no one seemed to be pulling it. No horses, no sound except the creak of its wooden wheels. It appeared as if from nowhere, the mist parting around it like a curtain. Ethan's heart raced, but curiosity got the better of him. Without thinking, he darted into the road and climbed into the carriage through the open door. It was empty, except for the faint scent of dust and old leather. He grinned, thinking how easily he'd pulled off the stunt. He sat down, ready to show off his bravery, but the moment he closed the door behind him, the air inside grew cold. His grin faded. That's when he saw the driver. At first, it was just a shadow. A tall, dark figure with a wide-brimmed hat, its face hidden. Ethan could see his hands, bony and skeletal, gripping the reins of the horses that weren't there. The figure didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Ethan at all, as if it were completely unaware of the teenager's presence. The carriage began moving again, but this time it felt different. There was no lurching or jerking like a normal carriage. It moved smoothly, gliding over the road without making a sound. Ethan tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to creep into his chest. "Hey!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the thick fog. "What the hell is going on?" The coachman didn't respond, his eyes still hidden under the brim of his hat. Ethan leaned forward, trying to get a better look at him, but that's when he saw the truth. The coachman's face was nothing but bone. A skeleton, its eyes dark, empty hollows that seemed to stare straight through Ethan. A chill ran down his spine. He tried to open the door again, but it was no use. The carriage didn't stop. It wasn't moving toward the town either. No, it was moving away from it, heading deeper into the unknown. "Let me off," Ethan shouted again, but the skeleton didn't react. It was as if the coachman couldn't hear him, or worse, didn't care. The road stretched on, endlessly, with no sign of civilization, no lights, no landmarks. Just fog. The trees on either side were twisted, their branches clawing at the night sky like skeletons of their own. Ethan could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Finally, after what felt like hours, the coachman spoke. "Where are you taking me?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. The coachman's skeletal hand reached up and pulled his hat lower, hiding his face even more. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the coachman said, "You will see soon enough." Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to get out, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The carriage seemed to be traveling on its own, as if it had a mind of its own. Ethan felt helpless, trapped in the cold, dark night. The landscape began to change as they drove further. The trees thinned out, and a dark valley opened up ahead. And there, in the distance, Ethan saw a massive, towering structure, more like a ruin, blackened and decayed, standing alone in the center of the valley. The carriage slowed as they approached it, and Ethan felt the air grow heavier, like something was suffocating the land itself. The ruins looked like a place forgotten by time, abandoned for centuries, Yet it had an oppressive presence that seemed to reach out, pulling Ethan toward it. As the carriage came to a halt, the coachman finally turned his bony head toward Ethan. His hollow eyes locked onto the teenagers. "You asked where we're going. Now you know. This is where the curse began." Ethan's stomach twisted in fear. "Curse?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The coachman's skeletal lips parted in what could almost be a grin. "I was once a man like you. I drove the carriage, transporting those who would never reach their destination. I was cursed to keep driving, to keep taking passengers into this endless night. And now it is your turn." The truth hit Ethan like a brick. The coachman was cursed to drive forever, carrying souls from one place to another, never stopping, never escaping. And now Ethan understood. The curse could only be broken by someone willing to take the coachman's place. Ethan looked at the skeletal figure, at the ruins that surrounded them, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. To break the curse, he would have to sacrifice himself. He would have to take the coachman's place and drive the carriage for eternity, carrying more souls to an unknown, terrifying destination. The air grew colder still, and Ethan could feel his resolve faltering. He wanted to scream, wanted to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. He was trapped, caught in the same curse the coachman had lived with for so long. The coachman leaned forward, his hollow eyes glimmering with the weight of 1,000 years of torment. "The choice is yours," the coachman said, his voice like the sound of dry leaves rustling. "Take my place, or remain a passenger doomed to ride forever." Ethan's heart raced. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the cold wind wrapping around him like a tightening noose. His choice would determine whether he would live or whether he would be trapped here forever, cursed like the coachman. But in the end, there was no real choice at all. The road would never stop, and neither would he. Story number 8, The Last Stop. It started out like any other road trip. A group of friends, Jake, Lucy, Sam, and Mia, on a cross-country adventure, ready to explore the vast, open highways and forgotten towns of America. They had been driving for hours, the music blaring, the jokes flowing, and the excitement of the open road keeping them going. But somewhere along the way, the roads started to change. The landscape became more desolate, the towns smaller and more forgotten. "It's got to be up ahead, right?" Sam asked, his eyes scanning the map. "Yeah, should be," Jake replied. "Just keep following this dirt road and it'll take us into town." The car bumped along the uneven dirt road, the tires kicking up dust in the rear view. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land. They hadn't seen any other cars in what felt like hours, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car's old suspension. "Looks like we missed the turnoff," Lucy said, looking out the window. "Doesn't matter," Jake said. "We're almost there, just a little farther." The road was narrow, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in on them, making the air feel thick and heavy. It was the kind of place where you'd expect nothing to happen. The kind of road that led nowhere, but seemed to go on forever. And then, just when they thought they were lost, they saw it. A large, dark carriage sitting at the end of the road. It was an odd sight, out of place, even in a town that looked stuck in time. It was pulled by 2 horses, but they didn't look like normal horses. Their eyes were vacant, and their skin was pale, almost translucent in the dying light. The carriage itself was massive, black, with intricate carvings all over its sides. It almost seemed to shimmer in the fading daylight, as though it wasn't quite there. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Is this some kind of tour?" Lucy asked, squinting at the carriage. "I don't know," Jake said, "but it's definitely not something I've seen before." The carriage door swung open and an old man stepped down. He was tall, with a long black coat that seemed to blend into the darkness. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes, cold, pale, and unblinking, shone out from under it. "Are you the driver?" Sam asked, his voice tight. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded slowly, then gestured toward the open door of the carriage. "A ride for travelers?" he asked in a voice that sent a shiver down their spines. It wasn't just his tone. It was the way the words seemed to hang in the air, as if they weren't meant to be heard by anyone living. For a moment, they hesitated. But curiosity got the better of them. The town was just up the road, they reasoned. What harm could a little detour do? They'd take the ride, maybe get a few pictures, and then head into town for the night. The friends climbed into the carriage, and the door slammed shut behind them. The interior of the carriage was unlike anything they had ever seen. The seats were deep and plush, upholstered in velvet so dark it almost seemed black. The air inside was heavy with the scent of musty old wood and something else, a sharp metallic tang that made their noses twitch. As the carriage began to move, the horses' hooves made no sound on the dirt road, and the world outside the carriage seemed to blur, as though the trees and fields were sliding past too quickly. The driver didn't speak, his back straight as he guided the carriage with an unblinking stare. The four friends exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. They were nervous, but they laughed it off, convincing themselves it was just a quirky local attraction. But as the minutes passed, the road ahead didn't seem to end. It was as if they were traveling in circles, the same dark trees and the same empty fields appearing over and over again. "Wait, haven't we passed this tree already?" Lucy asked, her voice uneasy. "I think we have," Jake said. His hand gripped the edge of his seat, his stomach dropping. "This doesn't feel right." They looked out the window again, and the road was exactly the same as before. "Okay, this is weird," Sam said, his voice rising. "I don't like this." The carriage didn't stop. It just kept moving, the wheels creaking with each rotation. The air inside felt colder, and the scent in the air grew stronger, more metallic. Then, like blood, they saw it. At the far end of the road, they saw the town. It was there, looming in the distance, but something was wrong. The buildings were dark, abandoned, their windows like hollow eyes. It wasn't the kind of town you'd expect to find on a tourist map. And just as they thought they were getting closer, the carriage turned a corner, and they found themselves back at the beginning. The same carriage, the same road. This time, the passengers were different. When they had first climbed into the carriage, there had only been the four of them. Now, as the carriage rounded the bend, they saw other people sitting in the shadows. At first, they were just silhouettes, figures that looked like they were asleep. But as the carriage turned again, they could see them clearly. Their skin was pale, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in eternal sorrow. They weren't alive. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't just stuck in a loop. They were part of it now. They had become passengers on the eternal journey, bound to this carriage for as long as it kept rolling. "Are we dead?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The old driver turned his head, his pale eyes catching the dim light. His lips curled into a grin that wasn't a grin at all. It was a terrible, empty stretch of skin, like something long forgotten. "The last stop is always the same," the coachman said, his voice cold and final. "There is no end, not for you, not for anyone." The carriage continued to roll, and the road stretched on, a never-ending loop. And as the miles slipped away, one thing became clear. Only one of them would be able to escape. But the cost of freedom was more than they could ever imagine. The others would be left behind. Story number 9. The Carriage Maker's Ghost. Lena and Mark had always dreamed of restoring an old mansion. When they found the place, tucked away on the edge of town, with its crumbling walls and faded grandeur, it felt like fate. They saw the potential in the decaying rooms, the high ceilings, and the sprawling property. For the past 6 months, they'd been working tirelessly, scraping layers of old paint, fixing the floors, and uncovering the beauty hidden beneath the dust of decades. One day, while they were out hunting for antiques to furnish the house, they came across something unexpected: a carriage sitting in an old barn behind a second-hand store. It was beautiful in a haunting way. The wood was dark and polished, the wheels solid, the craftsmanship impeccable. Mark had always been fascinated by old vehicles, and this one, with its elegant lines and worn leather seats, felt like it belonged in their home. The price was more than fair, and the store owner was eager to get rid of it, as if it had been sitting there for too long. "It'll fit perfectly in the front courtyard," Mark said, excited as he examined the carriage. "This place will look incredible with it." Lena agreed, although she couldn't shake the feeling that something about it seemed off. The carriage was too perfect, too pristine for something so old. As the months passed, Lena and Mark continued their restoration work, moving the carriage into a corner of the large front room. It was out of the way, but it became part of their home. They admired its beauty from time to time, but didn't pay much attention to it beyond that. It wasn't until the night started to grow longer that things began to change. Lena was the first to notice. It started with the symbols. Tiny carvings hidden in the grain of the wood that had been there all along but were now impossible to ignore. At first, they seemed like nothing more than decorative flourishes, small, delicate swirls, spirals, and loops. But when the moonlight hit the carriage at just the right angle, something strange happened. The symbols began to glow, a faint greenish hue, pulsing like some kind of heartbeat. At first, Lena thought she was imagining it. The house was old, and there were plenty of creaky floorboards and shadows that played tricks on the eyes. But one night, while Mark was in town picking up supplies, Lena stood in front of the carriage, staring at the glowing symbols, her heart pounding in her chest. They weren't just glowing, they were moving. The symbols shifted, twisting and turning as though alive. They seemed to pulse with an energy that Lena couldn't explain. Her hand shook as she reached out, but just as her fingers touched the wood, the glow faded, and everything went still. Lena backed away, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she had just seen, but she was certain that the carriage wasn't as innocent as it seemed. She didn't know why, but she felt like something was watching her, waiting. When Mark returned, she told him about the strange symbols, but he shrugged it off. "Probably just the way the light hits it. You're working too hard, Lena. You need a break." But as the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The nights were cold, even when the fire was blazing, and the air felt thick with something oppressive. They started hearing strange noises in the middle of the night, scraping sounds, faint whispers, like footsteps following them through the house. At first, they assumed it was the house settling, the old wood creaking and groaning. But then, they both began to have the same Lena nightmares. Dreamed of the carriage, but in her dream, it wasn't parked quietly in the corner of their room. It was moving, rolling down a dark road, drawn by horses with glowing eyes. She could hear the sound of the wheels, slow and steady, and the whispers grew louder with every turn of the carriage's wheels. She tried to scream, but her mouth was frozen shut. The horses, their eyes empty and hungry, were pulling the carriage toward something. Toward her. Mark had the same dream. He woke up in a cold sweat one night, his breathing shallow and frantic. "Lena," he whispered, shaking her awake. I don't know what it means, but it felt real. Like something's in the house with us. It wasn't long after that they began to notice other strange things happening. The horses, which had been mere carvings on the carriage, seemed to come to life in the reflections on the walls. They would appear in the dark, their eyes glowing in the dim light. And then, one night, they saw it. Two figures standing in the shadows, barely visible. A man and a woman, their bodies translucent, their faces pale and twisted with pain. They were standing near the carriage. Lena froze in terror, her heart racing. Mark, do you see them? Mark nodded, his face ashen. What is this? Who are they? The figures didn't answer. Instead, they simply stared at them with hollow eyes, as if waiting for something. The next day, Lena did some research, scouring the local library for any information on the carriage. It didn't take long for her to find something disturbing. The carriage had been made by a man named Elias Whitlock, a carriage maker from the 1800s who had become obsessed with building a vehicle that could transport souls to the afterlife. The story went that Whitlock had poured all his energy into creating the perfect carriage, one that could carry the dead to their final resting place. But there was more. After his wife died, Whitlock's obsession grew darker. He believed that the carriage didn't just transport souls, it could bring them back. And it did. Lena's hands shook as she read the rest of the article. Whitlock had died under mysterious circumstances, but his carriage had remained. It was said that the souls it carried didn't stay dead. Instead, they returned, twisted and hungry for life, for blood. The carriage hadn't just been a vehicle for the dead, it had become a trap. That night, as Lena and Mark stood in front of the carriage, the air around them grew cold. The symbols on the wood glowed again, but this time they were different. The pulsing light was red, and the whispers were louder, closer. The figures from the night before materialized in the shadows, their eyes empty, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions of hunger. It was then that they understood. The carriage didn't just take souls, it brought them back, and they were not the same. The souls inside the carriage were hungry, and they needed to feed. Lena and Mark knew what they had to do, but it was too late. As they tried to run, the ghostly figures lunged, pulling them into the carriage. The wood creaked as the door slammed shut behind them, and the carriage rolled once again, carried by horses with empty eyes. The journey to the afterlife had begun again, only this time the souls weren't going anywhere, and they would never be the same again. Story number 10, The Last Ride. Harold Carrick had always known this day would come. He'd seen the signs for years, his health declining, his body growing frailer with every passing season. But even so, nothing could prepare him for the inevitable truth. Tonight would be his last night on Earth. His family's old estate sat quiet and forgotten at the edge of town, a crumbling reminder of a time when he had been young and proud. His house, now empty and full of silence, echoed with memories that no longer brought comfort. For most of his life, the grand mansion had been a place of family gatherings, celebrations, and laughter, but now it felt like a tomb. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children had long since left for their own lives, leaving him to face the decline alone. But there was one thing he couldn't part with: the old carriage. It had been a part of the family for as long as he could remember, a symbol of something he could never fully grasp. It had been a gift from his father, passed down to him with pride. Now it sat in the barn, the once polished wheels covered in dust, and the leather seat cracked and weathered. But Harold couldn't bring himself to sell it. The carriage was a link to his past, a reminder of a time when life had seemed full of possibilities. Tonight, he decided, would be different. He wasn't sure why, but something deep inside him told him it was time to take one last ride. He wasn't going to wait for death to come to him. No, he would meet it head-on his own terms. He donned his heavy coat, grabbed his cane, and made his way outside to the barn. The night was cold, and the air was thick with fog, the kind of fog that seemed to come alive, wrapping around everything like a blanket of darkness. The moon, barely visible through the haze, cast a weak light on the old carriage as Harold approached. The horses, once strong and proud, now looked thin and tired, but they stood still as he approached. Harold didn't speak to them. He didn't need to. They knew their job. With a deep breath, Harold climbed into the carriage, the familiar creak of the wood beneath him echoing in the stillness. The door closed with a soft thud, and he settled into the worn leather seat. The driver, an old man, thin and hunched over, looked back at him for a moment but said nothing. He only nodded, and the carriage began to roll. At first, the ride was peaceful. The road was quiet, the horses trotting steadily through the fog. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the dirt path was oddly soothing, like the slow ticking of a clock winding down. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories of his life wash over him. But as the night grew deeper, something started to change. It began with a whisper. At first, Harold thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the faint sound of the wheels turning. But no. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice he knew, a voice he hadn't heard in years. Harold. He looked around, but the driver was still silent, his face shadowed beneath his hat. And yet, the voice was clear. Harold, you left me behind. A chill ran down his spine. The voice was unmistakable. It was Clara, his wife, who had passed away all those years ago. Her voice was soft but full of pain, full of longing. He tried to shake it off, thinking it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the carriage continued down the road, the voices kept coming, one after another, each voice familiar and filled with anger. Why didn't you care, Harold? Why didn't you protect me? I trusted you. The voices came from the empty seats around him. Harold's breath grew shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see the faces of the people who spoke, but he knew them all. They were the ones he had wronged. His old business partners, friends he had betrayed, promises he had broken. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out their voices. The air inside the carriage grew thick, oppressive, and the temperature dropped. Each word from their lips felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. He was trapped in a whirlwind of regret, forced to relive every mistake he'd made. Please, Harold whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I tried to be better. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more demanding, as if they were pushing him toward something he couldn't escape. And then, the carriage turned a corner, and Harold saw it. At the end of the road, a figure stood waiting. It was a man, tall and dark, his features hidden in shadow. But there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. They were cold, unfeeling, like the eyes of a judge. The carriage slowed as it approached the figure, the sound of the wheels grinding against the dirt growing louder. Harold's heart raced. He tried to speak, to cry out, but the words wouldn't come. The figure stepped forward, his hand raised as if to stop the carriage. This is it, Harold. The man's voice was deep and as cold as death itself. You've reached the end of your journey. The carriage stopped, and Harold felt a chill settle in his bones. The fog around him seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the world whole. The voices, now deafening, screamed in his ears, each one accusing him, demanding answers, demanding justice. He looked around at the faces of those he had wronged, their hollow eyes staring at him with fury. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew it was too late. The damage had been done. He had lived his life making choices that had hurt others, and now, as he neared the end, there was no escaping the consequences. The figure stepped closer, and Harold knew in that moment that the carriage wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a judgment. His life was being weighed, and the price of his mistakes was finally being paid. Harold closed his eyes, accepting what was to come. The voices fell silent, and in the stillness the figure raised his hand. The judgment had been made. The last ride was over, and for Harold, there would be no return. As the carriage began its journey back to where it had started, Harold was no longer alone. The faces of the people he had wronged sat with him, their eyes empty and accusing, as the fog rolled in around them, and the road stretched on forever.